Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of the I was going to say the Rubber Gum Anime Podcast. Really starting off well here today. That's a different podcast August and I have. This is an episode of the Jams and Tea Record Club where each week one of the hosts recommends a new album for the rest of us to listen to, and we talk about it. This week we are talking about August's recommended album, which is, of course, Frank Zappa, one of August's favorite artists, his album Apostrophe.
Indeed.
And of course, we are here with someone else. August, why don't you introduce your guest?
All right, so I have brought with me a fellow Zappa worshiper, a fellow Zappa apostle, I guess you could say.
Zappa zealot.
Zealot? Yeah,
100%.
Riley.
I like that too.
Yeah,
So,
Yeah, thank you
Riley,
for having me.
Yeah, Riley, why don't you kind of introduce yourself and your, I guess, relationship with the music of Zappa, and we can get into this album and we can talk more broadly about Zappa and then get into the album in specific if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it all kind of started when I got really started engaging with Zappa was I had been introduced to Pink Floyd via The Dark Side of the Moon. And I started watching all sorts of videos, and I was probably a middle schooler at this time, but watching videos of them recording live and things like that. And I had seen them record with Zappa. I'm sure you've all seen the live recording of him in studio with them. And he kind of had his ideological differences with him, but they all just kind of naturally flowed together. And I liked his really unique sound. And I was like, this guy's just doing something different. And I appreciated how dedicated he was to his instrument, playing guitar, or if he was playing bass, whatever he was interacting with. I always thought that it was really impressive. So from there, it just launched me into the universe of Zappa. And I just was obsessed with it from there forward, and it continues to this day. So
fantastic. August, this is your recommended record club. You've obviously talked about Zappa and your dive into Zappa like throughout the podcast throughout this year, and each record you listen to, you've reported on how you feel about it, and it's we've kind of chronicled your gradually increasing love for Zappa's music. What is it about Zappa that you love, and why did you pick this record for us to discuss, the Apostrophe album?
So my kind of dive into Zappa was really essentially just listening to this and Hot Rats first, because I was going through a lot of the classics of progressive rock around October of last year, when I first really was introduced to Zappa and got into him. And I think it was just what really struck me was this very unique fusion of comedy and humor and levity with just fierce technicality and proficiency, as well as personality being a big part of the uniqueness of this record. And I think just of his career, as well as the kind of biting social commentary and just, the personality, the cult of personality around Zappa is something that really needs to be spoken for. Watching him in interviews, he's very naturally funny. He's such a magnetic figure that I really just kept listening and kept exposing myself and fell deeply in love with him. And picking this record was kind of a shared decision with Riley, because I basically asked him one day, like, hey, what Zappa album would you want to cover? You said Apostrophe, and that's a great choice just because it's this really concise record that just introduces you to about every aspect of his sound in the best way possible. It's a really great starting point, and it's one of his biggest records. So
yeah. So okay, well, I didn't realize that it was Riley's decision for this record so much. So Riley, why don't you talk about, I guess, what this record in specific represents for you in Zappa's catalog, and why you think it's sort of so important to acknowledge if you're going to talk about Zappa as an artist.
Well, I think August made a good point where it is really the quintessential Zappa record. I mean, it's the perfect jumping off point because it's not too obscure, but it's got enough of that satire. It's got enough of that lightheartedness while still being very, very serious in terms of musicality. Where if a new listener were to listen to Apostrophe, it kind of is like a gentle acclamation into his type of music rather than this baptism by fire where you're just like immediately hit with something that seems so unfamiliar. Like Hot Rats can be a very disorienting record to somebody that's not completely familiar with Zappa. And I think his storytelling on this record is fantastic. It's funny. It's got excellent guitars, and it's like the perfect album to listen to all the way through in one sitting because the transitions are just spectacular. They just flow perfectly. So I just think it's easy for beginners to Zappa, and I think it really is. It's catchy in that sense.
Yeah. Jake, Morgan, you two, I mean, what had struck you about you guys, because you guys are, I guess, less familiar with Zappa or more recently getting into his stuff, I suppose. What struck you guys about this record and the experience of listening to this album? If you have, whether or not you have reference points for other Zappa records, like what did you think, I guess, when you listened to it?
Well, I did listen to Hot Rats. I think like I heard Freak Out a while ago, but I listened to Hot Rats like 2 weeks ago, and just sort of because I knew that was sort of like canon Zappa, and the disorienting quality of that record is honestly like my favorite part of it. I still think that's probably my favorite Zappa record that I've heard thus far, just because that's just like in terms of instrumental proficiency, that's just one of the most dazzlingly amazing jazz infused rock albums I think I've ever heard. It's deliriously fun. It's also like more on the concise side, and I think that's something I actually admire a lot about some of Zappa's stuff, is that like on that album and on this one, is that there is sort of a conciseness that makes you feel like, a lot of progressive rock can tend to feel very like sprawling and expansive and kind of borders on being unwieldy at times. And, I love me some indulgent prog rock. I'm pretty sure a lot of us do. But I appreciate how Zappa sort of rides the line between being like boundary pushing, but also not so much so that it feels like masturbatory. There always feels like there's a sharpness and a refinedness to what he's doing. And Apostrophe specifically feels like the perfect synthesis of like Hot Rats is like very much like I'd say like a good solid 65% of that album is like just instrumental stuff. This album, however, it like sort of perfectly interweaves those like biting satirical lyricism and songs and storytelling in with the music a little bit more evenly, so it makes for a more tempered listen, I guess.
Yeah, there's like a refinement to all of it. So like I this week I re-listened to Hot Rats, and I listened to some other more recent sort of Mothers records around this time, like Grand Wazoo and Overnight Sensation. And I noticed like
I also listened to Overnight Sensation.
Yeah, and I noticed like specifically if I were to compare this to something like Grand Wazoo, where it's like that's real kind of the Mothers in full sort of jazz band mode, and it's quite loose and there's an exploratory tone to it that I talked about and the what we've been listening to segment of our last episode. But this is like all of that sort of the exploratory sort of jammy nature. Like there are certain aspects of a lot of Mothers and Zappa stuff that can feel like jam band stuff straight up. And that kind of stuff is quite cool, but it's like, it's so refined. When it appears on Apostrophe, it is so refined, so like paired to like the most essential elements. It's so like just tightened that it's always kind of like barreling forward. There's always a sense of forward motion. It's not a sense of kind of like moving around in a single space, kind of like exploring like some jam music can be. It's always like sense of like direction and linear progression. Like in the title track, for instance, which is the biggest kind of like instrumental sort of jam of the album, and features just some absolutely incredible playing, absolutely incredible jam work from, in particular, I believe that it is bassist Jack Bruce and session drummer Jim Gordon, who are basically going off together in this piece. It's more exploratory, it's more live, and it hits like when it hits in the record, when it happens, it's like this explosion of energy after these kind of more tightly compacted, refined, like kind of skit songs that tell this sort of continuous story. And then so it manages to weave between these different modes of Zappa without feeling like uneven or without feeling like slapshot in any way. I was really struck, and this is something that I felt I was able to follow and understand, and made sense more and more the more I listened to it, that there was such a tightness and refinement to this record that it was really like Zappa's in total control of all the different aspects of his sound and all the different things that he does, that he's able to present them in the most friendly and accessible way possible, while still like absolutely coating all of it in this streak of surrealist humor and storytelling that it's very kind of difficult not to get swept up in it. It's very easy to get on board with it, but also at the same time there's enough there to kind of challenge you and to kind of like confuse you, especially if you start trying to follow the narrative on this A side of this record, that it will like, you know, it will reward repeat listens, and it will like kind of entice you to engage with it more and more. And I thought that was really striking about it, listening to it multiple times this week.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the Apostrophe, the title track specifically, because of the fact that that is always one that is a nice change of pace from the A side, where the A side is that narrative and everything like that. And then once you get into the B side, and Apostrophe hits, not only is the instrumentation, fantastic, but the mixing on that track is excellent. And in hearing the clarity of Zappa playing both lead and rhythm guitar and the way that they've been mixed together, it almost makes it feel like you are physically there. And I listen to this both on vinyl, and then I also will listen to it through a streaming service, just so I can kind of get any differences that there may be between the analog and digital platforms. And it always just still brings me to that mindset where it almost feels like it is so accessible, it's so clear, and it just, I appreciate the instrumentation on that big time. So I'm glad you bring that track up.
Yeah, like every time I listen to that, it feels like a live performance. Like it feels like it's being a live performance that's being captured, but that's just down to the way that it's mixed, and to the kind of like, you know, free nature of the playing that's happening on that song. But yeah, Morgan, I'm curious to hear from you what you thought of this record, because I know you're probably the most new to Zappa, and probably, maybe, I don't know if it's fair to say, the least likely to really engage with Zappa, generally speaking. But I'm curious what you thought about what your expectations were, and what
that's a little unfair.
What your expectations were and what you thought listening to this record.
Well, I had absolutely no expectations, because I mean, for me, this could either be like, since I know how sort of eccentric Zappa is perceived to be, I felt like this could either be a Beefheart or a Tim Buckley in terms of how I fell on the spectrum. And this was I'm happy to report this is much more Tim Buckley than Beefheart. But yeah, considering that this is my first time listening to anything by Frank Zappa, it all felt very fresh to me in a way that I'm sure it must have felt to literally everybody who listened to this dude in 1971, right?
It's 74. This one,
yeah, 74. Well, I'm not sure I was expecting it to be this much fun to listen to. I always knew Zappa had a sort of screwball edge to him that I should have probably expected, and I very much enjoyed it as a result.
Yeah, like it doesn't take itself seriously in a lot of ways, and it's just absolutely laced with that kind of absurdist humor that I've mentioned as well. But like you've talked about sort of social commentary as well, and there is like a real sort of undercurrent of that to a lot of it, which I think sort of climaxes, for lack of a better word, in Uncle Remus, which is my favorite song on this record, which I think is an absolutely stunning kind of fusion of the musical brilliance of Zappa and his band, and also like how incisive he can be as a writer as well. Yeah, and I think he does that throughout the record, but the way that it all kind of comes together by the end of it is, it's really satisfying, and especially with this record being as brief as it is, like really 30 minutes, and you see the track lengths, and you see like multiple songs that are like, half the songs on this record are 2 minutes or shorter, and you're like, is this going to work? But it's so much less about songs and so much more about this holistic kind of experience, this kind of journey that it takes you on. And that is because of how tightly constructed it is, because of how beautifully and deftly the different kind of pieces interact with each other, and then come full circle with songs like Uncle Remus and Stinkfoot at the end of the album. It feels like this vision that's been realized in a very satisfying way.
And and I think that's a really great jumping off point to talk just about kind of the A side in its totality on this record, which I think is a very it's really just such a great immediate introduction to this album, because you get the Don't Eat the Yellow Snow to kick it off, and you've got that fusion of that really chilly kind of almost sampled sounding wind sound effect, which also harmonizes with the song in a really satisfying, interesting way. And you also get kind of callbacks to that earlier doo-wop sound, which Frank Zappa took from on his 60s records. And it really does, feel, and it's such a great way to kick off the album.
Yeah,
like the female harmonies in the background too are just so great. Like it's so great, like accent to so many of these songs, just sort of introducing that as like a textural choice, I think, for all of the music here. It really like fills out the mix on these songs a lot of the time.
Of course, those being provided by the Turner sisters.
Who?
Damn, really?
What?
Yeah.
Yes. And
wow.
One of my favorite little vocal runs of this whole album is that little hook on Cosmic Degree of "Look here, brother, who you driving with that cosmic debris?" Which I've had stuck in my head for days now. Like that's such a and that's a great song as well. But yeah, just to go back to that sort of opening suite, like the surrealist sort of narrative that starts in like the Arctic Circle and then ends in like a kind of weirdly like, sort of heretical, subversive takedown of religion. I haven't even really fully unpacked it, but it just goes through like these different locations and locales and characters. It reminded me, like, had a kind of Jodorowsky vibe to parts of it.
A little bit.
Imagery. And like it's such a strange little thing to follow, and when it's peppered with like the guitar theatrics of Nanook Rubs It and those weird kind of eccentric like vocal deliveries, again, so much of this, like the storytelling is kind of fascinating and pulls you in, but a lot of it is the way that Zappa enunciates as a performer, the kind of tonality that he sings with, and the way he kind of portrays the perspectives of the characters in these songs. And it's a lot, there's lots to take in, and it's very entertaining.
And one of the great things is the back and forth you get between him and his guitar, which is a very fascinating element, where he is kind of using the way he plays his guitar is almost as if it's another singer entirely on the record, especially on Nanook Rubs It In. And it becomes even more apparent if you listen to some of his live material, where it really is an extension of him, this second voice. And it's fascinating, I think.
I think one of my favorite things about this record in general is how it feels really collaborative in the way that so many like Miles Davis records, for instance, felt collaborative. Like somebody earlier mentioned the bass contributions of Jack Bruce, who, was the bassist in Cream with Ginger Baker and Eric Clapton. So,
shit.
not just Joe Schmo, who happen to play the bass real well.
Yeah, and so it's Bruce and Jim Gordon on the Apostrophe. Obviously, Jim Gordon also being the drummer and Derek and the Dominoes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and then the fucking Turner sisters. I think there's this real great spirit of collaboration while also being sort of really singular. And I think this sort of confluence of ideologies, I guess, in terms of music making, lends itself to something really, really fascinating and entertaining.
I'd have to say on Uncle Remus, I think that's like one of the tracks that perfectly encapsulates some of that communication between the players in the band, but also, like August brought up, when you have that communication of Zappa and his guitar, there's just something about those two main solos in that song that just like scream expression to me. It's almost like, it reminds me of Maggot Brain, where you have like this really screaming guitar that is just so it like August said, it seems like an extension of a personality, and I think Uncle Remus is fantastic.
Good shout
doing
with Maggot Brain. There's a lot of Eddie Hazel in that playing, like absolutely coming from the same sort of place. And I like what August said about the way that Zappa does almost treat his guitar like both an extension of himself, but also like something with actual characteristics that he's interacting with and playing off of. And that's really fascinating to think about and have that as a framework when listening to the man play, because he just puts so much. It's not a matter, like, he doesn't play with this particular emotionality necessarily, but he plays in a way that's emotionally expressive in so many different ways, and that spirit of collaboration that you guys have talked about, and that kind of reaching a peak with Uncle Remus is also meaningful as well, because that is essentially a civil rights song, not the first civil rights song that Zappa's written. I mean, of course, you go back to Freak Out and Trouble Every Day, which is my favorite song on that record, and I think one of the best songs, one of my favorite Zappa songs in general as well. And this, again, is up there with my favorites too. Some of his most lyrically, I mean, again, it's irreverent, it's silly in some of the phrasings that he uses, but it's quite weirdly touching as well. Like, there's a kind of moving nature to the way that he sings about, like, have you seen us, Uncle Remus? We look pretty sharp in these clothes. Unless we get sprayed with a hose, it ain't bad in the day if they squirt it your way, except in the winter when it's froze, and it's hard if it hits on your nose. Like, that's sort of, absurd and silly, but like there's an underlying kind of sadness and an idea of suffering in there that Zappa's kind of communicating and doing in a way that's not like, laborious or on the nose. Sorry, no pun intended. It's just it's weirdly moving, and he's able to do that in a way that's not easy to do.
I love the piano embellishments on this song so much. I think it adds that sort of, that sort of dramatic weight to it. It kind of helps. It's like sometimes they kind of harmonize some of the guitar licks a couple times, and they kind of go out of step with it a couple times too. It's just it's fucking fantastic.
I will say, if you really specifically enjoy the piano on this, George Duke, the man who's playing the keys on Apostrophe, has a live performance of Uncle Remus that's really slowed down, and it's got a very jazzy element to it, almost like ballroom jazz, where he's playing this song independently and he's singing the vocals, and hearing him sing it versus hearing kind of the goofiness of Zappa, it's so interesting to where he's totally changed the tonality of the song, and it seems like something that kind of does strike that emotional chord a little bit harder. So that's always something I like to recommend people that ever find kind of an appeal with Uncle Remus.
Absolutely.
I guess one thing that is fair to acknowledge about this album is, I think, the one moment I would say is not as strong as everything else, which is Eccentrical Fours. While I think this is still a kind of compositionally fun song with the kind of buzzing, kind of droning guitar in the back, it does not, and kind of, the kind of almost typical Zappa kind of bubbly guitar notes. It's also not a track that leaves as much of an impact as the rest of this album, which I think is unfortunate. It does end up feeling, to me at least, more like a transitional moment between these two greater parts of his ideas than it does a properly developed
It's
song.
hard to follow up Cosmic Debris in general, so I think that's a task I wouldn't want to put onto any song, but
yeah,
I agree with that, actually.
Yeah, and I think you're probably right. Fortunately, with its kind of brevity and I guess quick fire nature, it doesn't really take too much away from the record.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, and it is like sandwiched between two absolutely stunning songs. Cosmic Debris, I haven't really talked about as much. I mentioned how much I love that Turner Sisters delivered hook, really, really great. But also just love like with the songs that precede it, there's just a really kind of funny and kind of gripping storytelling streak to this track. Like it's the weird sort of characters that Zappa portrays, the mystery man, and these like weird figures that
the tone of his voice was like, I could reach Nirvana tonight. Just I love that shit, man.
Yeah,
yeah,
it adds so much, and like yeah. It really sets a vivid scene. Both the characters that he presents to you, the way he chooses words, and the way that he intones in that way, like really sets a vivid scene.
This is, I think, really the track where I'm just completely sold on Zappa, not just as a guitarist and writer, but also as just a singer. As you guys have mentioned, he has this almost seductive quality to his voice, I think. And yes. It's such an alluring, interesting song to listen to in a way a lot of his other songs, aside from like I'm the Slime's intro, don't quite reach. I think that's a very fascinating, it's a fascinating point, and I think it's just got such a fun story, and I think leads us into conceptual continuity, which is something I think needs to be addressed in any discussion of Zappa. Riley, would you care to get into a little bit of conceptual continuity for us?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to describe Cosmic Debris as kind of like an Easter egg of a Zappa song, because of the fact that he references Camarillo Brillo. I mean, the only reason I say it like that is because
with the poncho part,
the poncho at the very end, of course, and then he also references the Grand Wazoo, so you can see that he's got this callback to his prior music, and the element of satire while still maintaining so much professionalism, not only by his contributions by way of songwriting and by way of his performance, and like you said, the seduction in his voice, but with the backing vocals, and it's just it is a perfect launching into the next side of the album. So yes, I think that conceptual continuity, the Easter egg, I think it's perfect.
It's worth mentioning as well that the first side A of this album and Overnight Sensation were recorded at the same time, I think even in the same sessions, and then with the obviously they're side A, and they're records that share the same sort of musicians and personnel, so you could see even the second side of this record as being like sort of quite distinct from the first side in that sense, and that the first side's kind of like a continuation of certain elements of Overnight Sensation with the referentiality there that you've mentioned, and then the second half of this record almost like displaying a little bit more of perhaps the feeling of the more improvisational feeling, sort of like live performances and more exploratory stuff that's less kind of like restrictive, and so in that way, like I said earlier, it kind of gives you a fuller picture of everything Zappa could do at this particular point in time, but also like ties it to his previous work in ways that you've mentioned as well. So I think they often get paired together, those two albums, from what I can gather, and I can see why, having listened to them both this week.
And one thing I would say, I think the references, as Zappa goes, do extend a little further beyond that even. Like the most obvious one that comes to mind is Waka Jawaka having the words hot rats on the sink handles. But what's fascinating, and I don't know if this is still up anymore, but there is a website where you can go and track down like every reference in every Zappa song to every other Zappa song or album. It's like this massive web, and it's really fascinating to dive through.
The Stephen King of music.
The Frank Zappa cinematic universe.
Yeah.
That sounds like it would be not to take words directly from the album, but incredibly fucking sleazy, and I would be all here for it. Every movie in this Frank Zappa cinematic universe would be directed by Brian De Palma, and it would be fucking awesome.
Or it would be directed by Frank Zappa, and
fair enough.
200 Motels.
I want to see Willie the Pimp the movie.
Yeah.
That's just Taxi Driver.
One more thing we should go over is the last track, Stinkfoot, in Proper, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
This, of course, kind of being this, once again, continuation of this whole satirical angle with the jokes about imaginary diseases.
Yes.
Quite a humorous little embellishment there. But this is this is, I think, a really fascinating point in the album, because it's really where he's kind of taking all the ideas, the jazzier stuff, the storytelling stuff, and the more rock-leaning stuff, and putting that all into a singular song, packaging that together, and then presenting it to you. And it really feels like this kind of fascinating kind of climax, final note, conclusion to the record. I think that's a really great track to send you out on.
Riley, what do you make of Stinkfoot as a closer?
So it's kind of funny. I've had like a really weird relationship with Stinkfoot because it's the track after Uncle Remus, and if I'm listening to the entire album, nothing gets better than Uncle Remus. That's like it's probably, if I were making a list of my top 10 songs, it'd be up there. And I would always just kind of lift the needle when I get to Stinkfoot. I'd always just be like, it's one of the longer tracks on the album. It's kind of a slog to get through. But when I was listening to this record again in the last couple of weeks, all the way through, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna have to listen to this one with a real critical ear this time. And I've always kind of taken it as a very satirical track, and then I kept finding myself listening to some of those riffs and then immediately scrolling back so I could hear it again. And I swear I was picking out different nuances every single time that I was like, wait a minute, this is genius. And I would just keep going back and appreciating it more than ever before. And then the other thing is, as far as the satire goes, he's still kind of got that like almost weirdly creepy, seductive voice when he drops bromidrosis, and I'm like, oh, it feels gross, and I love it.
Yeah, it kind of hits at that theme of like almost like salesman exploiting people that's like seen throughout like his discography really, but like mostly on this album, where it's like the promise of selling something that it won't like live up to, something that's like ultimately kind of hollow, which I feel like is a really like big Zappa-ism. And also I have to the voice where he does with the like, come here Fido, sends me every time.
Appreciate as well the callback to Overnight Sensation. I think it's Dirty Love with the poodle bites, the poodle chews it.
Yes.
Yeah, again, that sort of lyrical reference, bringing it full circle again, like the first half being recorded in the same sessions, and then you have like additional references that tie back to that as well. So like, I hadn't like been aware of the whole conceptual continuity thing until I started really like researching this album this week. But now it's like, once you become aware of that, and once you kind of start to see how these records relate to each other, you do kind of start to fall in the rabbit hole a little bit. And so that's like, I could see why, how you could become so like super sort of obsessed with Zappa, because like that self-referentiality, that sense of like his all of his music being this like kind of holistic tapestry that is all like connected and gives you insights into different aspects of this man's personality, of this man's interests, of this man's way of viewing the world, makes like it means that you can't really ever get a full picture from one single record. Like the whole point is that his sort of oeuvre is what, you know, you have to kind of take it in to really understand it. But I think from what I've experienced so far, from what I can gather, Apostrophe is as good as any sort of single statement he's done at like giving you that wider picture.
Absolutely. It's just and that's such a great reason for why it's picked, and why Zappa still remains this big force of personality for the people who are really into this sort of music, because it's just so alluring, and there's also something just extra to it. And I guess one final note I did want to address was that kind of just the criticism Zappa received at the time, and to an extent at present, from detractors of his brand of music. Robert Christgau, notoriously not a fan, and his sentiment, it has been kind of echoed throughout the ages, of finding Zappa's music unemotional and dull in that sense, beyond just a comedic standpoint. So I really wanted your guys' perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think we should ask Morgan first, because he's the person who is, again, as said, least likely to engage with something like this, just because of general distaste for something like Captain Beefheart, which I also share. He's not alone in that. But generally speaking, what is it you say that you think gravitates you towards this, in like, or any kind of art like this in general?
I mean, I think the biggest draw for me is the sheer brilliance of the musicality, and something like Trout Mask Replica is like anti-music, so it's just like the complete opposite of what I look for. And the fact that like so many people involved in this record are like prodigies, that creates a sort of emotion in itself that I get from listening to so much sort of quote unquote indulgent progressive music or jazz fusion albums. As for the sort of irony and satirical edge this has, I mean, it definitely helps that this is actually funny. That's entirely subjective, you know, but it certainly helps from my perspective that I actually find this amusing. And admittedly, this sort of something this satirical and lighthearted in this way has a bit of a ceiling with me. It's not 100% what I gravitate to in general. So, and you know, this wasn't really something that was going to change my mind or perspective on that.
Yeah,
I think something like Nick Cave's Murder Ballads probably comes the closest to writing the line like that, sort of between sort of really emotionally investing me while also being, you know, nuts.
Yeah,
I feel like we fall in line on the same level, and you would probably, as a result, enjoy Hot Rats a lot, like I do, in the sense that that's a little bit more focused on the jazziness and the instrumentality of everything. So if you want to go further your Zappa journey, that's where I would recommend.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, I'm just looking for a direction, because the dude like woke up and shit out an album every day of his life.
He quite literally during his life released more albums than the number of years he was alive.
Well,
Jesus Christ. Devin Townsend moment.
Just to cap off, I guess, on the notion of like why we maybe are more inclined to enjoy something like this than maybe the music press were at the time. I guess we kind of, one of the things I think we as a podcast really, really value is virtuosic talent displayed well. And like we don't tend to criticize, virtuosic showcases of musical ability for the sake of being there. Like we tend to have a lot of patience with stuff that perhaps the music press in the mid 70s or even today might call masturbatory. Like I think we are maybe more inclined to give that sort of stuff the benefit of the doubt and to be more positive and appreciative of that sort of stuff. And we often are, when we talk about progressive music in various forms on this podcast, we talk about stuff that explores the limits of what music can be, explores like compositional boundaries and pushes them, pushes also the boundaries of good taste as well. Like we are more often than not, I would say, celebratory of those things when they're done with kind of genuine flair and passion and skill. And I think perhaps throughout the history of music journalism, there has been, obviously it's been a shifting tide and shifting perspectives and shifting tastes, but there's been throughout history, I think, always been very vocal detractors who perhaps are maybe louder voices sometimes than the people who are enthusiastic, or perhaps have more sort of like cultural cachet, or more sort of like, taken more seriously for whatever reason. But we tend to be, I think, a little more open to the stuff that exists on the fringes. And so I think that's why what Zappa does probably is so well suited to us and to this discussion.
I think we find an inherent passion in that technicality. Like there's a love and a warmth and I just sort of feel the love of the musicians sort of like talent for what they're doing. It has to be born out of something, and I feel like if you translate that love and that passion into the music, which Frank is very, very good at, I feel like that's what gets us. Because another thing about us, we celebrate virtuosity, but I feel like we also are very hard on sleeve people who really like it when we can emotionally connect with something. And I, for one, definitely do with stuff like this on that kind of technical level.
Yeah, absolutely. Riley, any kind of final thoughts? Anything else you want to say to sum up, I guess?
I guess the one thing, just kind of thinking about Zappa's other material, because I know Jake had kind of mentioned like, well, if you're interested in getting further into the Zappa rabbit hole, I do think it's worth getting into for other people. And Zappa kind of reminds me of artists that aren't afraid to kind of push the limits with a genre. And I think he really shows that with like tracks like Father Oblivion, because of the fact that it's like, oh, if you don't like this part, skip 10 seconds ahead and it's like a totally different song. I know you guys have covered Mr. Bungle on the show before.
That's what I was just thinking.
Multiple times, yeah.
And a song that perfectly encapsulates that is like Carry Stress in the Jaw off Disco Volante, where it's like skip 10 seconds ahead, totally different. And I think Zappa does the same thing. So I think if somebody were to listen to this album and think like, maybe not really for me, I promise there is Zappa out there that is gripping. There is Zappa out there that is like shocking in a sense. I think that kind of perfectly sums up the critics' response to it as well, where it's like, I didn't like this element of this. Well, there's something else in the Zappaverse that you're going to find to be particularly appealing. And I think it inspires that. Tyler, you had mentioned the musical technicality and like the differences in that, and the way that it's really each one of these musicians, their skill is shown. And I would just say, just to encourage people to continue checking out Zappa. He's a fascinating figure. His books are fantastic too. I think that's worth mentioning.
Fantastic,
yeah.
I'm glad you brought up Mr. Bungle, because that was immediately something that leapt to mind, especially in the way that the self-titled album sort of is also in part, in its own special way, social commentary. That was like a lot of what we talked about in our episode on that album.
There's like a spiritual connection, I think, between Mike Patton and Frank Zappa in a lot of ways. as like writers and artistic visionaries, and with their concerns.
Lots of progressive musicians. I mean, I said Devin Townsend definitely has a lot in common with Frank.
Yeah, there's totally like a whole lineage of like particular like artistic approaches that, you know, it's all part of that tradition, I guess. Well, August, anything else you want to add? You want to wrap up, or you want to just
yeah, I guess just the last kind of bit I wanted to say. Yeah, I think Riley, you make just a fantastic point about this idea that if you're not satisfied with something Zappa's made, the best thing you can do is to push forward and find that something else, because he never settles down throughout his career, and that's one of the most admirable aspects about him, that you can never find a lull or a moment where something stops going forward. And there's definitely a lot of distinct eras to his sound, and finding the one that's perfect for you it may take some time because it's a large catalog, but it is in there for everyone, I believe. I mean, and Apostrophe is really just the best place to jump in and see what you like, and from there you can very easily find other albums you'll like. So yeah, I think it's a brilliant album, and it's like 30 minutes long.
Yeah, hell yes, I'll drink to that. All right, well then let's finish up as we always do by tradition by listing each of our 3 favorite tracks, least favorite if we have one, and giving the album a rating out of 10. Jake, why don't you go first?
My 3 favorite tracks.
Fire alarm. I'll be back in a minute.
Oh no. My 3 favorite tracks are going to be Cosmic Debris, Uncle Remus, and St. Alfonso's Pancake Breakfast is a particularly charming moment on the album we didn't speak a whole lot on, but I do particularly have a fondness for that one. Yeah, my least favorite is probably the brief Eccentrical Fours, which really I won't harp on the album too much for having that there, just because it is so brief and it is so instrumentally proficient that it's like it only really suffers by the fact that it's sandwiched between 2 excellent songs. If I have any misgivings with the album, it's honestly just like not my particular brand of what Zappa is going for, even though I do generally love most of it. I'd give it like a hearty 7.5 out of 10.
All right,
August.
Oh boy, 3 favorite tracks here. It's such a tough pick because I love like 8 of the songs here.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll just go with the ones that jumped out to me on my most recent listen. Uncle Remus, of course, just that beautiful emotionality to it. Cosmic Debris, and I'm gonna say Don't Eat the Yellow Snow. Least favorite, Eccentrical Fours, 9 out of 10. It's just one of my favorites. I love it so much.
Beautiful. Morgan.
House Not on Fire, so that's something.
Sounds like a Frank Zappa song title, all right, though.
It's not dissimilar to the Mr. Bungle classic, My Ass Is on Fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Shout out to this album for not having Frank Zappa take a shit on it.
Yeah.
I will say my 3 favorites are Uncle Remus, the title track, and my favorite Tool song, Stinkfoot. Nothing. I got Tyler. That's something.
You got me. That was good. I appreciate it.
Least favorite, I'm also going to say Eccentrical Fours, and I will give this an 8.5 out of 10.
Beautiful. My 3 favorite tracks on this album are Uncle Remus, Apostrophe, and I'm going to say Nanook Rubs It. Just love the guitar vocal interplay and the storytelling on that track. It's just beautiful stuff. Least favorite track. I don't, I guess Eccentrical Fours, but I don't really feel like it's that big of a, there's that big of a distinction. So I'm not really I'm going to abstain there. And I'm going to give the album a 9 out of 10. I thought this was brilliant. It gets better every time I listen to it. Riley.
Not to sound too much like a parrot, but I think my picks would be exactly the same. Remus is by far my favorite. I love that track. That again, the guitar solos I think are just fantastic. I would also say Apostrophe would probably be my second favorite, just because I like the jam element to it. I like the fact that it just seems so welcoming. I'm always kind of a sucker for like just getting into like a groove like that, and then I don't know, it just feels so welcoming even as a musician. And then the last thing I would say is Nanook Rubs It, but the second half of that song where it's like really echoic and like ambient, that's where I'm like, yeah, this is it. I always this.
I always laugh when he does the I can't see.
Yeah, those are so good.
Yeah, that always makes me smile.
It's fantastic.
It's just
least favorite. Yeah. Least favorite might have to be maybe St. Alfonso's, but every time I think about the fact that it's inspired by an Imperial margarine commercial, I think like, no, the satire's there. So just in terms of the satire of it, it'd be that one.
Yeah. What does he say? Like, it's St. Alfonso's pancake breakfast where I stole the margarine. I can't remember how he
stole the margarine.
And she abused the sausage patty and said, "Why don't you treat me mean?" That's really like, I love the little bits of like just really like outrageous innuendo and stuff that he'll just pepper in there. Good stuff.
Yes. There's a 1974 TV commercial for this album, and it's like weirdly drawn in this like obscure cartoon design, and I think it just perfectly matches the sound of that.
Yeah, like one thing that struck me again doing research on this was like how successful commercially this was. I mean, for Zappa, obviously relatively speaking to his other stuff, but still just like generally as well, like it seemed to be a record that did quite well. And you have to really, I guess, imagine a vastly different, popular musical landscape to really, be able to get that, because it's so like, you can't really imagine this being all that popular, but it's just a different time.
Definitely.
Yeah. Anyway, do you have like a rating you want to give the album on a 1 to 10 scale?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because Hot Rats would get a 10 for me, I'd give this one a 9.
Alrighty. So that gives us an average rating overall across the 5 of us of 8.6, which I think is a pretty fair and representative average. So yeah, Riley, thank you for joining us. Do you have anything you want to plug, anything you want to shout out while you're here?
I guess my own podcast on Spotify and Apple Music, or Apple Pod, whatever the Apple thing is. It's called Conjecture. Yeah, Conjecture and Lecture. Cover a whole range of topics there. We're talking about some comic books coming up here soon. So
that most
would
recently
be...
you had an ice hockey episode, if I am to remember
talked
correctly.
Some hockey on there. Talked a little bit of hockey, and we've got some interesting episodes coming up. We're just kind of pulling out of left field. We threw together a Spotify playlist. All of that can be found at the Conjecture and Lecture podcast homepage. So that would be my big plug. But I just want to say thank you so much for having me on. This was really fun. One of my favorite albums. So it was great to meet you all, and I appreciate everything, guys.
An absolute pleasure to have you. It's always nice when we can have someone on who like is able to speak on something they're like super passionate about and can give that extra dimension to it. So yeah, really great to have you. We'll make sure that we put a link to your podcast in the description of our video as well. So
you hear that, Jake?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay, subtle shade there, I guess.
I haven't messed that up in like 6 months. Fucking eat me.
I know. I'm still holding to it. Okay.
But yes, if you're watching for us or because you found
This
us
aggression will not stand, man.
through, if you're watching because you're a subscriber or you found us through a Frank Zappa forum, we're going to try and publicize this as much as we can. Then make sure you go and check out Riley's podcast, and make sure you go and check out our other videos as well. Like we've mentioned, we've covered Mr. Bungle, we've covered Captain Beefheart, we cover obscure and weird and strange like pieces of alternative music history all the time, every week. So if you enjoy what we do, if you enjoyed this
We
video,
also cover Limp Bizkit.
yeah, we did.
Yeah.
We did review the new Limp Bizkit album, and that was certainly something that we did. But if you
Yeah.
enjoy that, and if you enjoy what we do, and you're new to us, then check us out. Check the page out. Subscribe if you like, and we'll be back again next week. I think next week's Record Club episode is on Porcupine Tree's Light Bulb Sun. We're continuing our coverage of like all the big Porcupine Tree records as we build to their new comeback album next year. And yeah, that's basically all there is to it. August, why don't you send us out?
Yeah, I mean, as always, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Morton Salt. When it rains, it pours.